Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Psalm 118, verse 24. Greetings and salutations, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us here today at the Global Series 2023 Tete with Dr. Don Paterson, a sharp, witty, contemporary poetic voice. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to welcome Mr. Don Paterson, a renowned Scottish poet of our time, to this prestigious meeting today. He has a strong ear for rhythm and understanding of the sense of sound attributable to his background in music. His poetry is known for emotional timbre and lyrical tenderness. Dr. Don Paterson is a figure of immense reverence and relevance in the literary world. His impressive works of poetry, criticism, aphorisms, and music have earned him numerous awards and accolades. His works have been widely appreciated for successfully reconciling contemporary subject matters with its traditional lyrical tendencies and have made him a highly sought-after figure in the literary world. He has a dedicated readership and a veritable cornucopia of awards and prizes to his credits. I'm extremely appreciative of your presence here, sir. I am delighted to have you with us and look forward to having a fruitful dialogue with you. I'm sure that your deliberations will open a new window of understanding and knowledge and an opportunity to discover uncharted territories in your work for our attendees. Once again, on behalf of the Research Center of English and our participants who are ready to drink from the fountains of wisdom, I thank you for being with us and I extend a very warm and hearty welcome to you, sir. I would like to register my utmost appreciation and gratitude to the convener, Dr. S.J. Kala, Associate Professor of English and Dean of Research at Fatima College, for initiating this Tete series, which offers a unique opportunity to listen to thoughts and ideas of influential writers, poets, and critics of our time. The Research Center of English is very proud of her for bringing together this global gathering of scholars, writers, and readers to engage in such intellectual exercises. Congratulations, Kala. I also congratulate the organizers, Mrs. A.J. Bernita, Assistant Professor of English, Ms. A. Smriti, Research Scholar, for their hard work and commitment in making this event a reality. I am delighted to welcome the faculty and the students of our institution as well as other institutions. I am overwhelmed by the great interest of our attendees to partake in this exploration of knowledge. I am confident that this event will provide a unique and enriching experience to all of us. I also hope you take away new perspectives, knowledge, and ideas that help you further in understanding of the creative writing process and its potential. I wish you all a productive time with Mr. Don Paterson here today. Thank you for joining us. May God bless you all.
Thank you, ma'am, for your words of welcome. I graciously invite Dr. S. J. Kala, Research Guide and Supervisor of Ms. A. Smriti, and Associate Professor of English, Dean of Research, Fatima College, to introduce our charismatic poet, Don Paterson. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Tamare. And thank you, Ms. Roslyn, for those wonderful words. Mr. Don Paterson is an immensely skillful poet of craft and restraint who speaks with a stunning lyrical voice. With his rich experience and expertise in the realm of music as well as poetry, we find that he becomes a natural poet, a passionate Scottish musician, a literary critic, an ardent educator, an adept editor are some of the many hats that he dons. He is a professor emeritus in St. Andrews University at Scotland that stands tall as the first established university in Scotland as early as the 15th century. Patterson has to his credit around 16 books of poetry, aphorisms, criticism, and translations. Born in Dundee in 1963, Mr. Don Patterson left school to pursue a career in music in London. His debut poetry collection, Nil Nil, isn't it different? Nil Nil, published in the year 1993, won the Forward Poetry Prize, and thereafter he returned from London to Scotland as a writer in residence at the University of Dundee. His second collection, God's Gift to Women, was published in 1997 and was awarded the T.S. Eliot Prize and the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. His poetry collection, The Eyes in His rendition of the Spanish poet and Antonio Machado's poetry, which was published in 1999. Landing Light is his third poetry collection, which bagged the T.S. Eliot Prize and the 2003 Whitbread Poetry Award. He was appointed as the Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 2008 and was also awarded the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry in 2010. He has published three collections of aphorisms titled The Book of Shadows, The Blind Eye, and The Fall at Home, which bear testimony to Mr. Patterson's brevity and wit. He also holds the honor of being elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. What a marvelous achievement! His recent collection, The Arctic, was published in 2022 and is deemed as his most moving and eclectic collection. Mr. Patterson's love for and talent in music is inherited from his father, who was a country musician. Together with Tim Garland, Patterson formed the Celtic influenced jazz ensemble Lamas, who recorded 5 whole albums and toured exclusively in Europe and Asia. Engaging in hobbies like origami and US billiards, Patterson currently lives in Kirriamure, Angus, with his wife Lisa Brockwell, who is also an established poet. Probably we will get to meet her also virtually very soon. We are immensely happy and proud to have such an ingenious poet and musician amidst us today. What a great honor. I'm really indebted to you for having consented to be with us virtually today. And it's my pleasure and privilege. And the Research Center at Fatima College as a whole is so proud to have you here virtually. In fact, we hope and pray that one day you will visit our Maryland, which is our campus too. Okay. Waiting to see you in person. So before that, I wrap up now with this introduction, short introduction. I know I haven't done justice to the persona you are, but still, it is just an iota of what you are. So over to Ms. Tamarai now.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the introduction. Words are made special when woven into a poem. Poems are made special when recited with heart and soul. Here comes Deepthi Tangam, Bavatalani, and Mary Josepha to present a beautiful rendition of Don Paterson's poems.
A very pleasant evening to everyone. I'm R.V. Deepthi Tangam, and I'm currently pursuing my English honors in Fatima College, Madurai. And I feel extremely honored to recite the poem Two Trees in front of the poet Mr. Don Paterson, who himself wrote this amazing piece. And my poem goes like this. One morning, Don Miguel got out of bed with one idea rooted in his head to graft his orange to his lemon tree. It took him the whole day to work them free, lay open their sides, and lash them tight. For 12 months, from the shame or from the fright, they put forth nothing. But one day there appeared two lights in the dark leaves. Over the years, the limbs would get themselves so tangled up, each bough looked like it gave a double crop. And not one kid in the village didn't know the magic tree in Miguel's patio. The man who bought the house had no dream. So who can say what dark malicious whim led him to take his axe and split the bowl along its fused seam, then dig two holes? And no, they did not die from solitude, nor did their branches bear a sterile fruit, nor did their unhealed flanks weep every spring. For those 4 yards that lost them with everything, as each strained on its shackled root to face the other's empty, intricate embrace. There were trees, and trees don't weep or shake or shout. And trees are all this poem is about. Thank you.
Bavatalani?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone gathered here. I'm really pleasant and very heartwarming to recite the wonderful poem written by Don Paterson, titled Here, and it goes like I must quit sleeping in the afternoon. I do it for my heart, but all too soon my heart has called it off. It does not love me. If it down tools, there would soon be nothing of me. Its hammerbit says, You're not I am. It prints me off here like a telegram. What do I say? How can the lonely bird know who has sent it out or who has heard? Long years since, I came round in her womb enough myself to know I was not home. My dear sea up in arms at the wrong shore, and her loud heart like a landlord at the door. Where are we now? What misdemeanor sealed my transfer? Mother, why so far afield? Thank you, everyone.
Josepha?
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. Here I am to recite Why Do You Stay Up So Late for Us?
Josepha, would you please turn on your video? Yes, yes, thank you. You can proceed.
Why do you stay up so late for us? I'll tell you if you really want to know. Remember that day you lost 2 years ago at the rock pool where you sat and played the jeweler with all those stones you had stolen from the shore. Most of them went dark and nothing more, but sometimes one would blink the secret color. It had locked up somewhere in the stony sleep. This is how you name the ones to keep. So I collect the dull things of the day in which I see some possibility, but which are dead and which have the surprise. I don't know.
and I have no pool to help me tell. So I look at them and look at them until one thing makes a mirror in my eyes. Then I paint it with a tear to make it bright. This is why I sit up through the night. Thank you.
Thank you all three for bringing life into these soulful words. The wait is over. It's time for us to hear from the poet himself. With immense excitement and pleasure, I hand over the session to our guest of honor, Dr. Don Paterson, Scottish poet, to enlighten us on the topic A Life in Poetry. Sir?
Thank you for these very kind introductions and beautiful readings. I should do a little technical check with you first of all. Is that I talk a little bit about and just give a brief kind of talk about a life in poetry as seen from the agenda, and maybe what I could do in the course of that is just do it in the form of talking about the various books that I've published and what I was doing in my life when I was writing them, and just tell you a little bit about myself. I can, as my students will testify, I can talk for Scotland, so I have to watch and not go on for too long. So I shan't, because I think the most interesting thing will be when we do have a tete-a-tete, and I can hopefully answer some questions you have. I'm sure you'll find that more enlightening than me talking about me for too long. Where I am right now is a town called Kirriemuir, and that is in the kind of sort of middle north of Scotland. It's near a huge mountain range, well, huge for Scotland, called the Cairngorms, which lies just to the back of my house here. And Kirriemuir is a tiny little town made out of red sandstone from a local quarry. And I live in what used to be a vicarage. It used to be the vicarage of the United Free Church of Scotland in Kirriemuir, and that's my house. And this is actually the shed in the garden I'm broadcasting from, but my house is just over there. I could probably show you the garden if I flip cameras here. There we go, just give you some. Nope, all I can do is turn the camera off. So you'll have to take my word for it. So I'm out in the garden here. And I've lived here before. I came here when I was a kid. I raised my children here, but I've lived in other places too, particularly in Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland, as you know, and for many years in London. I worked down there as a musician. What else can I tell you about Kirriemuir? The one thing that you may know or have come across is the figure of Peter Pan. You know, the boy who could not grow old. You know, have you heard of Peter Pan? The author of Peter Pan, both the novel and the play, was a man called J.M. Barrie, a very famous Scottish novelist and playwright. And he was born about 5 doors away from where I'm sitting right now. So he's a very famous local figure here, the author of Peter Pan. And all the kids go to school with a little Peter Pan emblem on their blazers in Kirriemuir. So that's where I am. And in terms of where I've been, well, I mean, you gave a very full and a very generous biography. But yes, I was born in Dundee in 1963. So that grimly means I'm coming up for 60 years old at some point this year, which I can't believe because it's gone very quickly. And I seem to have learned nothing in the meantime. But anyway, so I'm from Dundee, which is quite close to here, about 15 miles south. So I haven't travelled too far in the scheme of things. But I didn't really have any idea that I wanted to be a poet. And I think that's the case for a lot of poets. Some of us come to the art quite late and don't write it in our teens and don't even have any particular love for poetry until later on. So I didn't start writing until I was 21 or 22. Although I should say my father discovered something in the attic of our council house in Dundee. I'm from, I don't know what the equivalent is where you are, but I'm from what the Americans call the projects, which is, which is basically poor state-owned housing, so I grew up in that, on what we call a scheme here, a council scheme. But my father was rummaging about in the attic one day, and he found something from primary school that I'd written when I was 6 years old. And it was this kind of story and picture thing we had to do every day. And I'd written, when I grow up, I am going to be a peot. I couldn't spell it. I spelled it P-E-O-T, and write poetry. So I seemed to know at the age of 6 that was what I was going to do. But I promptly forgot that for 15 years and never thought about it again, which sometimes makes me think maybe these things are kind of wound up and ready to go inside you somewhere, and you kind of know deep down what you're going to do. But it's not until the right circumstances come along that you actually do it. So the circumstances in my case were, well, I had, as a visual aid, I should be able to pull a book out and show you something, but unfortunately the book is at the bottom of this huge pile of books that I appear to have written that I was going to hold up as visual aids. I'll show you in a minute. But my first 20 years were spent in Dundee, and I've just finished a memoir about that time, a book called Toy Fights, which came out a couple of months ago, about my first 20 years, mainly just playing music. It's actually got very little to do with poetry because it wasn't in my life then. But after that age, I moved down to London to work as a jazz musician, to play basically improvised music on the guitar. And that was when I discovered poetry in London. And I did so for a number of reasons. I had something to say in poetic form. I had something to say to a girlfriend of mine by way of apology that only a poem would do. And I also discovered poetry in the form of a man called Tony Harrison, who was a Yorkshire poet from England who was very popular in the 80s that I saw on television one night when I was staying in a horrible kind of squat kind of bedsit in North London at the time. And he came on TV and he'd read some elegies for his parents, by which I was very moved. And I'd never ever thought about reading poetry before, let alone writing poetry. But I rushed out and borrowed his book from the library and read these wonderful, as I say, elegies for his mother and father, a book called Continuous. But the most striking thing about that book was that it was written, I had always thought poetry was written by posh and rich people. Posh, rich, white, English, male, old, often dead, people from, from around London. And I was astonished to find someone from my own background, a working class background, using that experience to write poetry basically in the language of Shakespeare. He wrote poems that were in iambic pentameter. I'm sure you know what that is. That's a line that Shakespeare always defaults to. He was a classicist, so he's very learned in his references. But the material he drew on was stuff I recognized from my own life. And I suddenly realized that I could make material out of that too for poems. Well, the first thing I realized was that I liked poetry. I didn't know that. So I read him. Then I read people like Seamus Heaney. Some of these names you may know. Robert Frost, the great American poet. The great German poet Rilke. Excuse me. There'll be a bit of throat clearing. Emily Dickinson, and I could go on. So a lot of Irish poets, especially, who are very good, and a lot of American poets. And then I started to write, and then it was just like a kind of addiction, really. The one thing you should know about poets is that many of us have very obsessive personalities. It's an odd character trait about poets. The other funny character trait about poets is they can't drive a car. I don't know why that is, but no male poets I know can drive cars. They drive them off the road. They're very bad. In fact, if a male poet offers you a lift in a car, don't get in the car. It's very dangerous. Female poets, for some reason, are very good drivers. Don't ask me why. But the other thing about poets is they have obsessive personalities, So mercifully, my obsession then took the form of poetry. So I was studying jazz in the day, taking lessons from some great players and working very hard. And at night, I was just reading and writing and trying to teach myself how to write poetry. And I went about it in a kind of musician's kind of way, which is to say, I read the kind of standard textbooks, and I thought that poets had to know all the words. So I read the dictionary. So I made sure I knew. It was really very stupid looking back on it, but I read the dictionary. I made sure I knew all the words, and then I read some technical manuals about about poetry. And I think that's maybe why a lot of my poetry sounds kind of old-fashioned. I was very pleased that you chose to read poems that rhymed and that had meter, because about half, 60% of my poems do that, for the simple reason I think people like them more, and it makes them more memorable. It's very simple. It's not a complex reason. The guru system is the way to go. You identify who you want to be taught by, and you chase them, and you don't leave them alone until they agree to teach you what they know. So that was pretty much what I did. I harassed a lot of older poets to tell me the things I needed to know, because I admired their work and wanted to write like them. So I was very fortunate. I got lessons from a man called Don the Rules, and they agree on what the measures of success are. It's good to be competitive, and I think we all raised our game at those workshops. We all tried to write the best poem we could that week and bring it in. And by best, I mean the most interesting, the wisest, the most enlightening, the most musical, the most memorable, and the most moving poem that we possibly could. So it was a healthy competition at the time, I would say. And I was very fortunate in that my early poems, even though I look back at them with some embarrassment, met with success at the time. I was lucky to get published early. I think sometimes when your book comes out, you only feel like a poet when you're in the act of writing a poem. And I think it's too easy to forget that if you start to get obsessed with the idea of validation and publication and being loved, as we all want to be. But sometimes, so I was fortunate in as much as I got some early success. I don't know why, but I'm very pleased that I did. So this was that wasn't the first book, but it was also kind of the product of its influences. I was very indebted at the time to an Irish poet called Paul Muldoon, who's a friend of mine now, and a very wise and brilliant poet. But I can see now these early poems were too much an imitation of someone I admired. So I kind of pushed through that. At some point when I'm going through this horrifically large pile of books that I appear to be responsible for, I may read a poem just before I wind up this wee talk. I'll just go on for another 10 minutes or so and then stop. Don't worry, I won't go on forever. I am not, despite appearances, I am not my favourite subject. Okay, I'm happy talking about many other things, but not me. But I'll do it on this occasion. And then after that, I think someone mentioned this book here. The title "God's Gift to Women" is with heavy irony. I certainly did not think I was God's gift to women or anything like it. So it was meant to be a joke. The poems themselves aren't particularly funny, and it all took a rather kind of grim turn at this point. As I say, I think a lot of the poems concern themselves with kind of masculine themes, and some of them are sort of addressing really quite dark issues about misogyny in society, and somewhere maybe in the heart of men. I think testosterone is maybe the most dangerous chemical in the universe, and I think I was trying to sort of address that and address my own thought and behaviour and everyone else's as well. And I think, and for some reason, again, that book met with more success than it should have done, and won a couple of prizes. And by way, I think, of apology to the universe, I then translated Antonio Machado. Now, Machado is a kind of Spanish mystical poet. I don't know if you've heard of a poet called Lorca. Lorca was more famous than Machado, but wrote around about sort of roughly the same time in the 1920s and 30s. Machado was more spiritual. And wrote in the tradition of someone like, I don't know if you know Juan de la Cruz and John of the Cross, some very famous poems in the Catholic tradition by John of the Cross, that Machado very much writes in the shadow of himself. They're very Spanish, they're very much concerned with nothingness and with the nada in Spain. and quite kind of odd in their parallels with Buddhism. Sort of that side of Catholic thought that's concerned with via negativa. I don't know if you know about these things, but sort of with God's absence as well as its presence. So this was a book that was really about trying to find a spiritual language, which was tough for me because I'm not religious. I used to be, and I'm not, but I nonetheless consider myself spiritual. So a lot of my work is trying to find a way back to that kind of language from a secular perspective. So this was one attempt to do that. I'll maybe read a tiny poem and just and run away. Here's a poem called Poetry. So this was written as a version, a very free version, not a translation, of a poem by Machado. So these poems are nothing like the original, really. Poetry. In the same way that the mindless diamond keeps one spark of the planet's early fires trapped forever in its net of ice, it's not love's later heat that poetry holds, but the atom of the love that drew it forth from the silence. So if the bright coal of his love begins to smoulder, the poet hears his voice suddenly forced like a barroom singer's, boastful with his own huge feeling, or drowned by violins. But if it yields a steadier light, he knows the pure verse, when it finally comes, will sound like a mountain spring, anonymous and serene. Beneath the blue, oblivious sky, the water sings of nothing, not your name and not mine. So that was a poem by Machado, and that was me trying to find out what poetry was for, and which is still a question I ask myself. I don't think poets are ever very settled on that question, if they take poetry seriously, because the answer changes from one year to the next. Sometimes I despair of poetry having any effect in the world at all, and on other occasions, on days like today, I start to think maybe there's something in this stuff. Maybe it really does bring us a little bit closer together. I should mention one thing I started to do around this time was write aphorisms, and most people don't even know what aphorisms are, and that's good, because the best definition of an aphorism is from my little brother Stephen, that I've heard, who's a bit younger than me, and he said an aphorism is somewhere between a poem and a waste of time. He said it wasn't a very kind thing to say, but I've written 3 books of these things now, where frankly no books would have sufficed. But anyway, I keep writing these things. So and they're really kind of short kind of statements that are supposed to be that strike you as true. I'll read a couple just to give you the flavor. This is the first one from a book called The Book of Shadows. There's one on the cover. All my teachers have been women, though several men have taken me aside for an hour to tell me things they know. There we go. Or another one might be, falling and flying are near identical sensations in all but one final detail. We should remember this when we see those men and women seemingly in love with their own decline. So you can see that they're sort of between poems and prose, and they're written in a sort of in a kind of European tradition, and also an Eastern tradition of I suppose wisdom literature. But I don't think they're very wise. But I wouldn't recommend them. But it's aphorism is the other thing, the only other thing in the world other than jazz that pays worse than poetry. So don't be an aphorist. You will be very poor. After that, there's a book called Landing Light, and that was maybe the best book that I'd written. I think it was the most grown-up book that I'd written, and there's a reason for that, which is I had children, and children are the one thing that might conceivably stop a man from remaining a child for the rest of his life. And my children taught me to grow up. So there are poems in this book for my kids. I have twin boys. Russell and Jamie, they're now 23 years old. So there's a lot of poems in here about them as babies, and the experience of fatherhood. But they're now 23 and hairy and have beards, which is like but they'll always be my babies. But so I think that changed the kind of things that I wrote about, and sort of, and changed my whole sensibility in regards to poetry, and what my focus then became. It's much less about masculine insecurity and much more about, I think, other people, I'd hope. And what I did after that was this. Sync up my camera again. This is another book of versions of a really famous and important sequence, and it's it's a spiritual sequence of poems called Die Sonette an Orpheus by the great German poet Rainer Maria Rilke. Rilke, probably the greatest European poet of the last 150 years. Really kind of astonishing, not a very pleasant guy, I should say, but kind of astonishing man and an astonishing poet. And he wrote these as alongside another thing he was composing called the Dueno Elegies, which is maybe a more famous sequence, but I think this is the more important book. And these are a series of sonnets addressed to the figure of Orpheus, and they really address the business about the way in which poetry bridges the here and now and the eternal, the way in which poetry and song cross the bridge between the living present and the world of the dead, by which Rilke means nothing morbid, just the way that we kind of sort of drag the eternal into the everyday. So yeah, as I say, I did this for myself really as a kind of active sort of orientation, and it's not a difficult read. I'm making it sound like a very esoteric text. It's not. It's also got a lot of sonnets in it, and I've written a lot of sonnets, and I'm also often called a sonnet lover, which wouldn't be true, but I do write a lot of them. I think for one reason or another, poets find sonnets easy to write. They're a kind of easy form to write in. They're a bit like musicians in, say, fugues, or 12-bar blues might be a better example. Once you know them, you don't have to think about how you improvise within them. You have to learn them, and then just exactly like a raga, you know it, you know its procedure, you know its rules. Then you improvise within it after you've fully absorbed it. So sonnets, 12-bar blues, these are all forms that we can be freer within. So that's why I've written a lot of them. More aphorisms, unfortunately. This book, frankly, is a cry for help. I wouldn't read it at all. This is a book called Rain. That was maybe the most popular thing that I'd published. Again, lots of poems about children and family, especially. And that poem that someone read beautifully, much better than I could read it, so I won't read it again, called Two Trees, was from this. The other big life event that this coincided with is my great teacher and my dear friend, my best friend, died. A man called Michael Donaghy, who was an American Irish poet who was born in the Bronx in New York and moved to live in England, in London, whom I got to know in the 80s. And I was very, very close to Michael and identified with him a great deal. So I couldn't believe it when he died at the age of 50 very suddenly. I still can't believe it. So much of this book is taken up again with elegy. Some of it's unconscious elegy. There are two poems that I didn't realize were elegies for Michael, and then there's a very long wail of an elegy at the end called Phantom. So that was Michael. His losses. He's a wonderful poet. If you don't know his work, I would recommend him highly. Then this thing. Horrible giant book about Shakespeare's sonnets. So this was a commentary that I wrote on Shakespeare's sonnets because I wanted to see if one could still read it as a contemporary text, because there are only really kind of academic accounts of Shakespeare's sonnets, and I think actually a lot of it still stands up as a kind of a guide or a diary about being in love, which is essentially what the book's about. So I wanted to write a much more contemporary commentary. So academics hated it, readers really liked it, but I got some bad reviews and some stick of some academics who felt I was treading on their territory. So, but it wasn't written for them. It was written for general readers and people coming to Shakespeare sonnets for the first time and reading it as contemporary readers. So it's an attempt to kind of unpack the sonnets and explain their references, but also what Shakespeare was trying to say and trying to make him a bit more real. And I'll skip through these final books because I think I'm talking too long. More sonnets. Couldn't think of a title. 40 sonnets seemed good because there's 40 sonnets. And that was a kind of an interim sort of book. And then I wrote a book for the poet that I mentioned, Michael Donaghy. This is a kind of an exposition of 50 of Michael's poems. Again, I tried to make it very approachable for people who didn't know his work, but I would say that if you don't know Michael's poems, it's the only book of mine I would recommend. He's a really wonderful poet. And like Frost, he kind of reads light, but means heavy. You can read him very lightly, and he's got a lovely singing line, a very open and approachable poet. But there's many, many, many layers to his work. So it was just an attempt to sort of explain how both singing and deep his poetry was. He's a kind of a modern metaphysical, if you know what I mean by that. He's a bit like John Donne in contemporary clothing, I think, or George Herbert. Moving rapidly on, this is everything I know about poetry in one handy volume that you can also use the block draft. It's a kind of unreadable academic tome on technical aspects of poetry. I cannot recommend it with any enthusiasm. It's full of very dense technical language. It was really written, so I could give up teaching, because I'd been teaching as as professor of poetry at the University of St Andrews for a long time, and I needed to stop, I think, and go back to freelancing. So I decided to write down everything I knew and more in one giant book. So there's an awful lot of boring things about meter and about symbol and metaphor and music in there that would only be of interest, I think, to poets. And even then, I don't know. But so that was that. And then recently, I've just been quite busy. More aphorisms, because the world needs more aphorisms. I'll read you one. The good thing about aphorisms is they're very short. So if you don't like one, there'll be another one along in a minute. Here's the first one. Consciousness is the turn the universe makes to hasten its own end. That's a bit heavy, isn't it, for this time of the day? And here's a very dark one. To a poet, a friend is just an inconvenience standing between them and a decent elegy. I can't believe I wrote that, but I did. But I did mean it as a joke in my defence. And latterly, just to wind up this little chat and bring you up to date, I wrote a sort of autobiographical book. Big time lag here. This was a sort of exercise in what I gather is now called autofiction. And there was this television series in the early 60s that I don't remember, it's before my time, but I've watched since, called The Twilight Zone, which is kind of strange tales. You can get all this stuff on YouTube, but really fascinating program in which there'd be some rupture in natural law. Some natural law would be tweaked, so time or space didn't work quite the way we expect it to work. And there'd be a narrative that would take place, sort of in this new kind of parallel universe. So what I did was I took every episode from the first season and wrote a poem around it, but put my life in it instead. So it was a way of sort of writing about where I was in my ongoing midlife crisis. I think what happens to men after 40 is that they are plunged into midlife crisis until they die. I think that's what we do, unfortunately. So this was really an attempt to kind of address my midlife crises, plural, through a sort of science fiction book, really. So it's like science fiction poetry. It's and it's in big long lines. I don't think you can see that. It's all. So that was odd. And I think this was me getting closer to prose, because what happened after that was this book, which isn't prose, which is my last, but hopefully not my last, my most recent collection of poetry. But this thing here, and Toy Fights is a memoir, as I say, of my first 20 years in Dundee, and just a kind of attempt to figure out how on earth it came to this, how we got to here, why I'm sitting here in Kerrymuir talking to you today about my own work, which is an honour and a pleasure for me to do. But just to kind of figure out where I came from, just in an attempt to figure out what I should do next, I think, so it seems like a good turn of the wheel for me now that I've given up paid employment, to figure out what I should write next, because I really don't know. I'm still none the wiser. I think as I go on, the traditional route is that one only gets acquainted with the depth of one's ignorance, so I now know an awful lot more about what I don't know than I did before. And that sometimes can lead to stasis, and feeling a bit frozen and not knowing what to write next. So I'm trying to figure that out just through writing memoir at the moment. So we'll see how that goes. But I think that's way more than enough about me, frankly, looking at the clock. So if you had any questions, I'd be very happy to attempt to answer them coherently. And if there's anything at all that you wanted to ask me more generally about poetry, especially if you write it yourself, that I could possibly help with, I'm very happy to answer that too. This is one of those awkward pauses, isn't it?
No, before yeah. Kamari, please carry on.
Yes, ma'am. Sir, it was really inspiring listening to you, sir. Thank you. If you have a dream, you can dream big, but work smart. Quotes Marlowe Thomas. It's the endless effort of the researcher on Don Paterson, Ms. A. Smriti, guided by the research guide Dr. S.J. Kala, that has landed up to this juncture. It's the time for the research scholar A. Smriti to interview her writer Don Paterson. Over to you, Ms. Smriti.
Now, before Ms. Smriti begins, I just want to say a few words about my candidate. I'm so proud of Ms. Smriti, who's been so hardworking, industrious, and persevering. Because even when she chose, when both of us decided on working on Mr. Don Paterson's work, we decided that we will somehow get hold of Mr. Don Paterson and have an interview. Since day one, she's been very consistently pursuing him on all sorts of social media, and finally she came and told me, ma'am, success, we have found him and got him. And so all credit goes to Ms. Smriti, who organized this event. And so I'm so proud of Ms. Smriti. My heartfelt appreciations, congratulations to Ms. Smriti, who made it, or who made this day for us, and who has paved way for such a wonderful event. So over to you, Ms. Smriti. May I ask you to be quick with your questions so that Mr. Don. Yes.
Sure. Thank you so much for the warm words, ma'am. Hello, Mr. Patterson. I'm immensely grateful to have this marvelous opportunity to interact with you. And you had bestowed us the pleasure of listening to your poems, and you read them yourself. So I'm more than happy. And moving to the interview. Sir, many of your early poems stand as a dedication to Dundee and Scotland. By now, I'm almost acquainted with Dundee and places in its vicinity like Angus, Fife, Newtile, River Tete. Do you have something to say about it?
Yeah, I think as I got older, I find that the business of place more and more important. And the way in which one's primal territory, that original landscape that you grew up in, becomes kind of important. And I think it was reading Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet in particular, that reminded me of the extent to which those places actually inform who you turn out to be, and the extent to which you're kind of continuous with them. So I started getting more and more obsessed. The further away I was living in London at the time, with my own local landscape back in Dundee. So I was in London, but looking through all these really local maps, really detailed local maps, of places that I'd visited when I was a child and I knew really well, and writing about those in an attempt, I think, to put down a route, and coming back to Scotland was a result of all that work on the kind of local landscape, because I didn't want to feel Scottish anymore. The one place you don't feel Scottish is here, and it's the one place that I don't hear my accent because no one mentions it. So it was all to do with me coming home, I think, so I could be just less self-conscious and just a bit more myself.
Yes. Taking the clue from your answer, writing is most often considered to be a self-introspective process. So how do you break free from the self-conscious ghost that would cling onto your back when you write?
Sorry, I missed the last bit. I'm so sorry. Could you just say that last bit?
So how do you break free from the self-conscious ghost that would cling onto your back when you write? So we tend to be a little self-conscious when we write.
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I think self-conscious is probably the death of art. I don't think you can do anything very good in art if you're self-conscious, because it means that your art doesn't then proceed from a generous instinct. It becomes about you, and it shouldn't be about you. I think it comes from you, and it can be about your concerns and spoken with your feeling, but it has to be outward facing and addressed publicly. Otherwise, it's just a diary, So I guess what I do, and the way that I try to achieve that is, this will sound strange, I sort of anticipate the condition of publication. So I imagine how it would be someone else reading my poem, is all. And I put myself in their shoes and I say, would this move me? And would I understand it? So I think that kind of it makes it feel more like a gift than, that it's something that you're trying to give away rather than keep. So it's about flipping the pole on it. And also, I think, the really good rule, and it's something Robert Frost said, is no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. No surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. By which he meant, if you do not move yourself or surprise yourself in the process of writing, the reader won't be moved and won't be surprised either. So that's the test. If you're moved while you're writing, not before, while, then you know that you have to trust that the reader probably will be too. So these are good rules for getting rid of that, as you say, the ghost of self-consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice to the budding writers. Thank you, sir. And for an English writer, literary and classical allusions are inevitable features. Surprisingly, I found Hindu mythological references like Krishna and Kali Devi in your works. Do these reflections hint your interest in them, or were they an unconscious influence?
No, they're pretty conscious, or at least they're maybe unconscious now, in as much as they become part of your range of illusion because they form part of your culture. As your own culture expands and your reading expands, and having read a lot, what here we would call Eastern wisdom literature, sort of in religious text, and I'm familiar with a lot of material, so. And I think also, it's just like what's very interesting amongst English language poets, as you say, is the reference to myth. But there's weirdly not a lot of engagement with biblical myth. With Semitic myth, there's a lot of engagement with Hellenic and Roman myth, but not so much with biblical and Semitic myth, which has always struck me as kind of odd, because that's formed as much part of our sort of upbringing as those other European influences have, So I think one just tries to honestly reflect one's reading, which is part of your cultural environment as well, And I think as long as it's unself-conscious, as long as you don't think now's the time to fly in a reference to Krishna or whatever, because that'll look cool. As long as you do it naturally, I think it's fine. Because that's the only guide you can ever have, is that you do it because you're doing it honestly. It strikes you as the best thing to say.
Yes, thank you, sir. Your poem Easter 2020 documents the vicious estrangement caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. would you please elucidate on the impact of the pandemic on you as a human and you as a writer?
I don't think we're in a position to assess it yet, because people talk about how it is over where you are, but here they already discuss it as if it was ancient history, which is amazing to me, given the hundreds of thousands that died in the UK alone. It's remarkable how quickly people are determined to put that behind them and kind of forget about it, and I think that's a dangerous approach. The same is true of all pandemics, incidentally. I mean, you find if you go and read about the Spanish flu in the UK, 100 years ago, it was exactly the same. They put it behind them as soon as they could, and all the dead were rapidly forgotten. So I'm determined that shouldn't be the case, and I think poetry is one way of reminding folk how incompetent, for example, our own government were at the time in terms of protecting its own population. They were dreadful. And I think poetry, because it's a memorializing art and it's about keeping things in a way that could be preserved in the memory, I think sometimes those things are also unpleasant. Some of those uncomfortable truths that might get forgotten are a good place, are good to put in poetry. It's a good way to preserve them. So poetry is, it's also good for preservation of necessary bad memories as well as good ones. So I didn't want anyone to forget about Boris Johnson, for example. That dreadful man. So that's why he's in here.
Thank you, sir. So can you please enlighten us about your passion for music, especially jazz? Because we are unaware of the genre here, jazz.
About jazz.
Yes.
Yeah, I've written a lot about that in this memoir. It was my first love before poetry. One of my it doesn't sound like it's much of a curse, but it's one of my minor curse is that I am slightly better at the thing that I love slightly less. So I really I love music. That's my first love, But unfortunately, I'm better at writing poetry. I would have it the other way around if I could, but you don't get to choose in life. So there we go. But no, I've always loved jazz. So, well, not always. I mean, I sort of came to it as a teenager, and it spoke to something very deep inside me. And because jazz is so accommodating and welcoming a music, I learned about lots of other music through jazz, because there's lots of crossovers. So I learned about Celtic music, my own traditional music, through jazz. And I was in various kind of fusion Celtic jazz bands. I learned about Indian classical music through jazz, through collaborations with Indian musicians, and then came down to classical Indian music that way. So jazz has taught me about just about all other kinds of music. So I don't know how you couldn't like jazz. It's just conversation, just in musical form,
Smriti, are you there? Smriti?
Usually the technical problems are on my side, so this is a novelty. It's usually me disappearing. So
there is a technical issue. But meanwhile, let me just give you, there is a surprise element which we didn't add on to the agenda. That is to say, 3 of them have translated your poems into Tamil. Smriti has translated, the research scholar has translated your poem Wave as Alai, Tamil. We belong to the southernmost part of India, that's to say Tamil Nadu. So Smriti has translated the poem, your poem Wave, into a Tamil one. And likewise, Miss Bernita, can you wave? Yeah, she has translated your poem Waking with Russell into
wonderful.
Tamil. Yeah.
Wow.
And Miss Tamarai, are you there? Can you wave? She has translated your poem The Air into Katru Tamil, another Tamil poem.
Uh-huh.
So three of your poems have been translated into an ancient language, Tamil. It's
That's
almost 2,000 years old, and more than that. It's a very, very ancient language, and it's translated into that. And then I have translated your poem into your poem, The Rain, which you showed us. The poem Rain, that I have translated into a Hindi poem.
Wow. Wow.
So four of your
I'm
poems.
very touched. Thank you.
So it's a kind of a tribute, a give. We thought we can give you something back that you can take to Scotland. So three of your poems are now translated into Tamil and one into Hindi, which I shall mail you later so that you can at least see how it looks like when we have translated them.
That's wonderful.
But we assure you that we tried our level best to retain the form of it, the poetic devices, the rhyming, and the content. So I think we are 80% or 85, probably 90% closer to what you have done. But then it's just a minuscule when compared to the pile of books that you have showed us. So that was a surprise element that we wanted to share with you once the interview is done. But because there was a technical glitch, I thought I will just give you that surprise element now itself.
That's very kind of you. I'm very touched. Thank you. I look forward to seeing them.
Yeah, we will send you at the earliest, as early as possible. In a day or two. Yes, Miss Smriti. Are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, fine.
I'm sorry about the technical glitch.
That's okay, Smriti.
Yes. Mr. Patterson, a quote from your memoir, Toy Fights a Boyhood. I believe social media has been a disaster for the species and has driven us suicidally out of step with reality. It sums up your views on social media. Sir, still, do you have something more to say about this?
Well, not much other than the fact I think it's true. I think, it was a very bad idea for humanity to have invented the internet and just left it to see what it did. I think that was it may be a defining foolishness. I think the main problem is that I believe in this will sound very conservative. I believe in institutions, not individuals. And I think, unfortunately, when structures are kind of crowdsourced and allowed to just emerge, from the kind of, the chaos of humanity, often those things aren't very good. And often they promote the interests of some really bad people, some very narcissistic individuals, some very bullying, and unpleasant people are promoted, through social media. I think this is just emerged. And it seems geared up to do that. It also seems geared up to present our very worst selves. I think one always is almost one's worst self on Twitter. I think it's just designed to bring out the very worst in everybody. And I think especially in the effect that it's having on young women, and the relationship to the perception of themselves and their bodies. I think Instagram and Facebook are monstrous, and I'm very worried about TikTok for other reasons. I'm worried about TikTok too because it affects people's concentration, and I now read, for example, that between the ages of 20 and 30, there's something like 30 or 40% of Americans don't consume any other form of media other than TikTok. I find that absolutely horrific. No books, but never mind no books, no television. No shared kind of long form cultural art of any kind. I think this is it's a terrible worry. And I'm afraid, again, not to sound like a terrible social conservative, but I think the only way now is regulation. I was pleased. I should say I speak as someone on the centre left politically. I was pleased when I saw in the state of Utah recently they're having a curfew on social media for children after 9 o'clock at night. They can't access it. If you're under 16, you can't access social media after 9 p.m. I think this is good. But I just think it's the start. It was very bad to set it up and not regulate it, and it's going to end very badly. So, sorry to be a harbinger of doom. But, yeah.
Yes, that's a powerful message, sir. Thank you. And as you said, I heard that you are working on a sequel to Toy Fights. Am I right?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Okay, sir. May I know when can we expect to see the book?
Well, I'm hoping to sign a contract soon because that usually gets you going. But it's I think I'll try and write it a bit more quickly and do it in 18 months. I think what it'll cover from me going to London and returning to Scotland, which is a period of about 16 years. That was a time of great mayhem in my life, even more so than the first 20 years. So there'll be plenty of incidents. Probably very little wisdom, but plenty of incidents. So I'll hope it will make for an entertaining read. I don't regard these as very serious books. No.
So my last question: musician, poet, educator. Where does your heart lie?
Guitarist. Yeah, my heart lies over there with my guitar. It's just like that's a terrible admission, but it's true. I had a couple of gigs last week, just playing in the background for just some jazz, in Edinburgh. Just with a friend of mine, just playing some standards from the Great American Songbook. Just playing and improvising some stuff in the background. And I was in heaven. I was never happy. I would do that for the rest of my life. But I must write books. There we go.
Sir, I know I'm too demanding, but will we get the honor of listening to a jazz number if you are willing?
I do have a good excuse, which is I don't have anything in here that would make a noise, unfortunately. So you're lucky. You'll be spared that. Otherwise, I'd be very happy to pick up my guitar. But it's, next time, I'll bring my guitar.
Sure, sir. So thank you so much, sir. And as a conclusion, I stumbled on this quote by William Carlos Williams' poem, which goes by the title Paterson. And I feel which encapsulates the Don Paterson that I see. So I quote, "A man is under the crassest necessity to break down the pinnacles of his moods fearlessly, to the bass, to the screaming dregs, to have known the clean air from that base, unabashed, to regain the sun-kissed summits of love." So with a grateful heart, thank you so much, Mr. Paterson. And it's an honor as a researcher, and thank you so much. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations, dear Smriti. I'm so proud of you. Now, here we have two questions from the participants. One is from Miss Monica. Miss Monica, are you there? Maybe I'll read out the question for you. You can turn on the video if you can. So she wants to know how much influenced you are by Frost, because she had been listening to your podcasts and she feels that you have been talking about Frost as a thinker. So she wants to know how much of influences of Frost do you have in you?
I know. I would like to think an awful lot. I've certainly tried to absorb as much of Frost's influence as I can. Frost was a really strange poet in as much as he used poetry as a sort of a kind of manipulative art. A lot of people get Frost wrong, and they think he's a kind of poet of homespun wisdom, and kind of fireside wisdom. Frost is a much darker poet than that, but he did a very clever thing, which is that he made poems that sound very light. And often very simple, and often very optimistic. And it's not until you read them carefully that you realize he's often saying something very, very different. And I think, I really admire the way in which, the song-like nature of his poetry lodges itself in the brain, because I think music it's one of the ways that you get things to go into people's heads much more easily. If it sounds musical and it sounds beautiful, they'll allow it in. And sometimes it's only afterwards, that they realize how dark or troubled or conflicted the actual content is. So I like that in Frost. The trouble with Frost is that it requires us all to share a definition of what a poem is really, and my worry is that tradition is now being lost, as poetry increasingly moves to a kind of form of short experimental prose. We may be losing that tradition, which I think would be a great pity, because it means that not only can you not work within it, you can't subvert it either. You can't do anything original with it. But yeah, I do love Frost. I mean, it's just like, and I think he's just in terms of, again, poetry as wisdom literature. I think he's a profound example, and there are the poems for every stage of your life with Frost that can tell you something about your place in in your life in the universe at that time. I'm reading a poem at the moment a lot called "To Earthward," which if I'd read it when I was your student's age, would have meant nothing to me at all. But it's I think it could only be understood by someone over 50, but I think it's Frost is just like he's a kind of dictionary of human feeling, I think, so I'd like to be influenced by Frost would be the short answer.
There's one more question from Miss Fatima, and she wants to know how much of what is your message to the young budding poets in this world? What's your message to the young budding poets around you right now?
I think learn to love poetry more than the idea of being a poet. I would say that would be the first advice. Check with yourself that you're really in love with poetry and not just in love with the idea of feeling like a poet. And the second piece of advice is always keep the company of people who are better than you, who can do it better than you, because it's the only way to learn.
That's good. Thank you. There's a question from Miss Bernita who wants to know that since you talk more about cyberspace, social media, and humanity, she would like to know if there is some touch of post-humanism in your poems. Post-humanism, because she's a researcher on post-humanism.
Yeah, the book that I would honestly sort of recommend if they were interested, and if I can find, I remember writing it. Here we go. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot on post-humanism and zonal, I would say, and which kind of look forward to a time. And she'll know what I mean by this. When we've moved from carbon to silicon, so some of the poems are very much set in the future where we basically become our iPhones, and I think while that will solve some problems, it'll introduce others. So while part of me welcomes the post-human society, because frankly humans aren't doing so well with the planet at the moment. I think there will be downsides, but it's something that concerns me greatly. Actually, I think of a lot, but I think interestingly, the only way you can sort of touch on that stuff in poetry is to kind of move into sci-fi, which isn't a genre that we naturally associate with poetry. So I'm sort of interested in the science fiction poem as a way of talking about these things, but it's I do obsess over it.
Okay, there's one more interesting question here. One Miss Niveda Nivi wants to know your views on writing poetry. Especially, she wants to know how can in this contemporary era, what do we do? Do we shadow the classical writers and follow them closely, or do we bring in new forms to the world, new forms of poetry to the world? That's an amazing question.
It's a beautiful question, and I think, of course, the answer is maybe predictable, which is it has to be both. But I would go a bit deeper, and I would say that the function of poetry is something that emerges naturally from the language that we all speak, anytime we encounter a new reality, or anytime things change in a way where the usual words won't do, we turn to poetic solutions to accommodate them or describe them, you know. And I think as the world changes more and more quickly, and actually we drive, you know, maybe towards a post-human future, it's very hard for poetry to keep up. So those new forms, you know, are coming thick and fast at the moment, simply as a reflection of that rapidly changing reality and the attempt to find language that's adequate to it. So it's an interesting time for form, but I think the huge mistake is losing touch with the past, you know, because if we do that, we have literally nothing. You know, we don't really have an art form anymore. We will have no gold standards, no measure of success, and no connection with our own tradition. And when that day comes, the art form won't be worth anything, I think. So we must do both.
Thank you, sir. Now, I don't know if this is Mr. or Miss Rainey George, who wants to know, what do you normally do when you have a block while writing? When you tend to write, you have the writer's block, and how do you overcome that? That's interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. I flip it around, embrace the block, and the block is part of writing. And if you wrote all the time, you wouldn't be a very good poet. It's just Dundee, where I'm from, is famous for a man who's known as the world's worst poet. And he was called William McGonagall. I don't know if you've heard of him. But there's a statue of him, not me, I should say. There's a statue of William McGonagall in Dundee. And he wrote, I'll give you an example of his poetry. The Tete Bridge over the river in Dundee blew down in a storm. And he wrote a poem about it called The Tete Bridge Disaster. And the start of it's something like, oh, beautiful bridge over the silvery Tay. Alas, I am very sorry to say that 89 lives have been taken away on this last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very, very long time. He was terrible. He was a terrible poet. And you know what? He wrote every day, and he lived in a state of constant inspiration. That was his mistake. So we need the block to know that we're doing it seriously, you know, and as a time of reflection, and just to make sure that we don't write the same poem again. So the best advice I got about the block was from a great Irish poet called Derek Mahan. And Derek said to me, you know, for us, reading is the same as writing. And I thought, that's it. So when I'm blocked, I read. Good. And then I feel like, because we're doing creative reading, it's all feeding in, you know, it's just like, and it's giving me new things to think about, and it's gestating, and, you know, but yeah. So just read, embrace the block. Block is good. Block is your friend.
Thank you so much. In line with it, there is one more question. There's a question from Mr. Amal Hussain, who wants to know how should we begin writing, or how should we sustain writing? Do we do it every day? Do we carry on this poetry writing exercise every day, or can it be taken up with intermittent breaks? Or you just want to know that?
I think there are two stages. I think when it's like anything else, when you're serving your apprenticeship, you should do it every day. And I think once you get good, you don't have to. So I think it's a very good exercise, you know, for if you consider yourself an apprentice or a student, to have daily practice, and just like sitting at the piano and playing your scales and arpeggios, I think you work on your form and you force yourself to write. And you don't wait to be inspired. You just go to the zoo. You just like find something to write about. So I think initially, I think sort of, you know, later on in your career, if you're lucky enough to have one, that's not a good approach. And it's good to have breaks, and it's good not to read lots of poetry. And but yeah, so I think it's different then. As I say, I think if you do it every day later in your career, it's very thin. You know, you will just repeat yourself, and I think that diminishes your work, you know, through repetition.
fine. I know the chat box is just flooding with questions, compliments, and all that. There's one Mr. Pradeep Dharmabalan who would like to say hello to you. And there is one Miss Akshara who wants to clarify what you just said. She says, you mentioned about poets having an obsessive personality. So she wants you to elucidate on it. And that would be a last question.
It's a great question. This is a tricky subject, but I think, I owe it to you to be honest about it. Sometimes poetry is talked about as if it was purely just a wonderful kind of healing and therapeutic activity. But sometimes as a practitioner, it can be quite demanding, and it can be demanding, especially on your unconscious, and it can be demanding in as much as you need to find things that inspire you and to write about. And these things can often be quite disruptive. And poets aren't always the happiest people in the world. And sometimes I do wonder if poetry, my throwaway line here is that poetry isn't really a calling, it's more of a diagnosis. It's more of an illness. And it's a funny one because I think it's a bit like, dyslexia, just like people that have dyslexia. Dyslexia often comes with strange other things because it's often just part of a syndrome. So you can be dyslexic, but you also get a lot of car sickness. People get a lot of travel sickness when they have dyslexia sometimes. And they often have amazing business skills. You find people at the very top of business of dyslexia. So it's actually sort of much more complex. It's much more like a kind of a syndrome. And sometimes I think that poetry might be a kind of a syndrome. And maybe it's to do with kind of crosstalk in the brain between different brain centers, where maybe things get mapped onto language that are quite synesthetic, that are drawn from the other senses, so that we feel words do more than other people feel they do. But what often comes, I think, with that weird the weird facility with language is an obsessive personality, as a tendency to focus quite morbidly sometimes on very narrow things. And sometimes these obsessions can be really positive, and sometimes they can be quite negative. So I think you have to watch that. And I think the other thing, as I say, that comes with it is a lack of coordination. I think, as I say, it's amazing the number of male poets who can't drive a car. I don't know why that is, but it seems to be the case. But sometimes I do think that, there may be something not entirely right with people who write poetry, but I think it's often reflected in this very narrow focused obsession. And I think it's good to know that, because that means you should work to make those obsessions positive. You should, if you know you have the kind of brain that is either going to be obsessed or just eat itself alive, then find a healthy focus for your obsession. I think if you're a poet, would be my advice. I haven't always done it, but I try to do it now. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Almost most of them are so impressed and they are very happy about this session. And now, before the formal vote of thanks, I would like to thank you personally for taking up time to be with us today, for spending your valuable time and sharing your thoughts of what made you a poet. And I'm sure this is going to be a great source of inspiration to many, because many look forward to being a poet after listening to you, I feel. And at this moment, I also thank and congratulate the head of the department, the head of the Research Center of English at Fatima College, Dr. A. Rosalind Mary, who was sweet enough to just give a consent to our request of conducting this virtual meet. So thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. I know she is presently far away from the college. She's at her mother's place, and still she's been sweet enough to join us and coordinate the whole stuff. So thank you so much, Ms. Rosalind, for being with us. And I thank all the members of my department, all the participants who are from the north, south, and east and west of India, who have taken time to be with us today. I hope it has been a fruitful and you have lots of takeaways. So thank you so much. Now over to Ms. Smriti.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Patterson, I'm profoundly grateful to have had the opportunity to personally hold the interview with you. Thank you so much for being a sport and enlightening us with your wit and eloquence. As a researcher, I'm extremely lucky to have the privilege and honor to connect with you. My sincere thanks to Daniel for the patient response to our mails and queries. I place on record my grateful gratitude to my research guide and supervisor, Dr. S.J. Kala, for planting the seeds of the Tete Global Series, which has been a boon to the research scholars. She has been my inspiring mentor, guiding me with her cheerful spirit and perceptive intellect. Ma'am, I deem it a great honor to learn from you. Thank you, ma'am. I'm honored to thank our secretary, Reverend Sister Dr. Francisca Flora, and our principal, Reverend Sister Dr. Celine Sahaya Mary, for their optimistic support and blessings. I'm grateful to the head of the department, Dr. Rosalind Mary, for her unstinted support throughout our research endeavors. I take this opportunity to thank all the erudite faculty members of the department for their support and guidance. I'm extremely grateful to my team of competent and dexterous fellow research scholars who have been extending their unconditional help and support for the smooth conduct of the program. I also thank the student friends who volunteered cheerfully to recite the poems of Don Paterson, and my many thanks to Kyle ma'am and the singers for their beautiful prayer song. Finally, I'm thankful to the amazing audience who tuned in. Your questions were engaging, and I'm sure Mr. Patterson found them interesting. We hope you had a fruitful time. Thank you all.
Yes, before we break, shall we all turn on our videos so that we can take a quick screenshot for us to cherish this event and this evening here in India? Yeah. Yes, please. Yes, yes. As many as possible. If you can turn on your videos, it would be fun. Yes. Thank you. So, okay. Thank you all. Thank you.
Just a word with Dr. Don Paterson. Such a rewarding experience. I thoroughly enjoyed. I had a glance of your poetry and I could see frost emerging there. I could see the frost in you because he's one of my favorite poets. And also the musician in you was very explicit in your poetry. Reading your poetry was one experience, but listening to you was more fruitful. I thoroughly enjoyed the program, and thank you so much for honoring our invitation and making this day. Congratulations to Dr. Kala, not only for initiating the series, but adding more elements into it. So recitation of poetry and translation has added more feathers to this program. Congratulations and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to meet you all. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye all. Bye.